In the spring of 1968, I was a 14-year-old kid in the 9th grade. I did all the things most boys in the 9th grade did back then, playing sports and riding my bike and getting crushes on girls. But events in the wider world were beginning to intrude. Primary among these was the U.S. war in Vietnam. Although it was a distant conflict, there was no way to avoid the war here at home. The killing and strife were brought to us in graphic detail every night on the TV news. By 1968, the American people were bitterly divided over the war. The presidential election that year wound up pitting Richard Nixon against then Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Both candidates had pledged to bring an end to the war, but Nixon went further. I have a secret plan, he assured the nation, to end the war in Vietnam. Enough of the American electorate believed him that Nixon would squeak to a narrow victory. I hadn't really liked or trusted Nixon, but I desperately wanted to believe that he did have a plan. Vietnam was not a place I wanted to go. Of course, as it turned out, there was no secret plan. Nixon's promise was nothing but a cynical politician's lie, but it wasn't just a lie. It was a big-ass lie. And it impacted millions of lives for years to come, including mine. Throughout the rest of 1968, 69, 1970, 71, the war in Vietnam raged on. And month by month, day by day, the war grew ever closer and more real to me. In June of 71, I graduated from high school, and that fall I headed off to college at Northwestern. Although the military draft had been in effect for some time, college students had always been exempted. But beginning in 1972, student deferments would end. Every male who turned 19 that year could be drafted. There were 7 freshmen in my small male dormitory, Asbury Hall, who had that big thunderhead cloud hanging over our heads. The draft lottery coming up on February 2nd. We called ourselves the Magnificent Seven. We were a diverse bunch, and we'd all quickly acquired nicknames. There was Weird Paul from Joliet, a chemistry major who dropped acid almost daily. Mike the Pollock, a psychology major from Milwaukee, loved basketball and Jack Kerouac novels. Mark the Hippie from Maryland was an engineering major who listened obsessively to the Grateful Dead. There was Larry the Militant, an African-American political science major from Kansas City who idolized Malcolm X. Keith the Thrasher, a music student from South Bend, Indiana who played the French horn, liked to trash the dorm lounge periodically just to let off steam. And there was Raphael, known as Cheech, a Mexican-American pre-med student from Dallas who could make unbelievable quesadillas on his hot plate. And finally, there was me, known as the Beach Boy, journalism major from Los Angeles. I enjoyed, engaged in, and partook of almost all the things the others did, except for the LSD. Each of us knew that if we drew a low lottery number, we would most likely be drafted sometime in the spring. The lower the number, the higher the likelihood you'd be drafted. Draw a number over 100 and you were safe. Anything under 100, you were in the crosshairs. Once you were drafted, your life could go in any of 4 directions. 1, the outcome we all dreaded, was being sent into combat in Vietnam. 2, you could refuse to report, then you'd be arrested and probably sent to prison. 3, you could enlist in the military before your report date, which supposedly gave you a chance to avoid Vietnam. Or 4, you could try running to Canada. Of course, it was more than likely you'd be caught at the border. You'd be branded as a coward and a traitor, and you'd probably wind up in Vietnam anyway. If you did succeed in escaping to Canada, you could never come back home. Each of these outcomes also meant leaving Northwestern and the college pathways we just barely set off on. All during that fall of freshman year, the 7 of us would invariably lapse into conversations about the draft lottery. Hippie maintained that we couldn't change what was going to happen, so why worry about it? Thrasher, he was just sure he was going to get a low number. He would meet a horrible end in the jungle, shot or blown apart or impaled on punji stakes, his body slowly consumed by giant leeches. Larry had mild asthma, which he hoped would get him a medical deferment. Cheech pinned his hopes on a bum knee. Mike talked of joining the National Guard. None of us could imagine the Army taking Weird Paul. He seemed oblivious to everything around him. I wasn't sure what I would do if I got a low number. Enlist in the Navy, head for Canada, accept my fate and go to Vietnam. Tried not to think about it. Of course, February 2nd finally arrived, and I was roused at 8 a.m. by a loud pounding on my door. "Hippie's room," Mike the Pollock barked. Minutes later, the 7 of us sat on the floor in a tight circle surrounding a radio speaker. Our collective tension was almost too much to bear. "Welcome to WNUR's coverage of 1972 Draft Lottery," an announcer proclaimed, sounding for all the world like a game show host. He explained that the numbers would be drawn from separate drums somewhere in Washington, D.C. First a birthday, then a corresponding lottery number. The dates and numbers would not be drawn in calendar or numerical order, but randomly. This meant that any of our birthdays could be drawn at any moment and assigned whatever number between 1 and 365 was pulled from the other drum. Finally, the show got underway. After about 20 nerve-wracking minutes, the first of our 7 birthdays came up. Hippies. Drew number 135. Hippie was safe. He whooped with joy and ran off to call his parents. After a dozen or so more dates, Larry's birthday came up. Drew number 144. More whoops and cheers. Then we listened silently as at least 50 dates and numbers were read off, which took almost an hour. No more of the 7. Someone produced a bottle of wild turkey, which we began passing around. Then 3 of our birthdays came up within a 15-minute span. Weird Paul drew 255. The Polak got 360. The luck of the Polish. Cheech drew 224. Each number elicited a new round of cheers and high fives. Of course, I was very happy and relieved for these guys, but I also realized their safe numbers meant fewer left in the drum for me. It was now down to just me and Thrasher. By the time another half hour went by and neither of our birthdays had come up, all the other guys had headed off to class or meals or work-study jobs. Each one gave us both a hug and wished us luck before leaving. The process continued on agonizingly slowly. Then Thrasher's birthday was drawn. We waited breathlessly for the corresponding lottery number. It was 2. Keith sat there for a long moment, stunned and speechless. Then he slowly stood up and left the room. "Sorry, Thrasher," I managed to say. Now every one of the 7 knew their fates except for me. I sat there alone with the wild turkey, numbly listening as a couple dozen more dates and numbers were drawn and read. I thought of all the possible directions my life could take going forward, most of them not good. Then finally my birthday was drawn. And the number for May 24th, the announcer intoned, is 246. It took a long moment for that to sink in. 246. I was safe. I wasn't going to Vietnam. I didn't have to join the Navy or run to Canada or leave school. I felt as if an anvil-sized weight had suddenly been lifted off my shoulders. I hadn't realized just how heavy it was until it was gone. The Vietnam War continued for the rest of that year and well beyond, but the draft ended after 1972. No more college freshmen, no one at all, had to go through what we had. Early in 1973, a peace treaty was signed. American troops began to withdraw, but this brought no end to the war. The fighting and killing continued as South Vietnam steadily crumbled. In April of 1975, the Viet Cong marched triumphantly into Saigon as the last Americans were evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof. I watched that spectacle on TV at Asbury just weeks before I graduated from Northwestern. Over 58,000 Americans had died in the conflict. More than 1 million Vietnamese perished. Today, it all seems so distant and surreal. Vietnam is now a U.S. business and trade partner, and it's a tourist destination for Americans. Go figure. And what of the Magnificent Seven? Mike the Polak got his PhD in psychology, became a college professor. Weird Paul became, amazingly enough, a neuroscientist. Mark the hippie wound up working in IT. Cheech is a doctor. Larry the militant opened a restaurant. And the Beach Boy became a writer. As for Keith the Thrasher, he withdrew from Northwestern 2 weeks after the draft lottery. He didn't tell anyone his plans, and none of us ever heard from him or of him again. When I visited the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington years later, I was too afraid to search for his name. It's now been almost 45 years since that draft lottery, and I still have occasional bad dreams about that day. I also think back to that big lie that I first heard at age 14. I have a secret plan to end the war. I hadn't really believed it then. And when it comes to promises or plans or pronouncements from politicians, I've never really believed them since.